difficulties with my screen share because I updated my operating system and it's not liking that. So I'll begin by just reading out the land acknowledgement and then turn it over to our first presenter, Pauline. And then hopefully in the interim, I can get that sorted. So welcome everyone to this session. Thank you for joining us. Although we're here virtually, Ryerson University is located in Toronto, Ontario. So I want to acknowledge that Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So with that, I would invite Pauline to begin our first session.
Thank you, Danielle. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah. Yes. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this conference is held. I come with respect, I come with peace, and I come with an open heart. This presentation, I'll be doing the presentation, but the presentation is of the work of Dr. To Alang, who cannot be with us tonight. We call him Alan, and Alan is a member of the Ka-Tu, Indigenous people of the Central Highlands regions in Vietnam. And this presentation comes out of his doctoral study. He submitted his thesis last year, and he passed with only minor amendments, and so he's now fully fledged doctorate. I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Mark Rose, co-supervisor, and proud Gunji Timaraman from the Western Victoria in Australia. Moving along, just trying to, oh, why is it not moving? Ah, here we go. I did ask Alan to share some photographs, give us a sense of his land and his people. And so here we are in the presentation outline. I won't go through that. You can see it for yourselves. I thought we'd start off by looking at the Vietnamese context. So Vietnam has 54 designated ethnic minority groups. The government doesn't acknowledge ethnic minority groups as Indigenous people. In fact, it's a very sensitive area. Some of them, of course, are not Indigenous people. So the Chinese group in Vietnam is an ethnic minority group. But many of them are, and they are Indigenous to their land. It's sensitive for a number of reasons. One is to do with different views on the ownership of land from Indigenous people, from the Vietnamese government, who sees the land as land of this belonging to the state. But also going back to the American War, there were often tensions, and some of the Indigenous groups actually sided with the Americans and the Southern Vietnamese. So it's been a very, very sensitive area. After saying that, though, the Vietnamese government has in recent years recognized the importance of its Indigenous people, and has introduced a number of policies looking at trying to encourage more Indigenous people into tertiary education to become doctors and teachers, and also giving priority recruitment into public sector agencies and promotion opportunities, career development, etc. So Badiani and his colleagues argue that the government policy is well begun but not yet done. And most of studies that have looked at the Indigenous workforce have been at the micro level, not the macro level, not that micro level. Here are some lovely photos that Alan presented of his people, his community in the Central Highlands. So when Alan first came to us a few years ago to do his PhD, he was very interested in, if you like, the human resource management policies of recruitment and promotion and training and development, etc. And, you know, looking at, you know, the impact that they were having. But we soon moved on from that and began to talk about the importance of voice and the importance of making sure, you know, how did we know whether or not these policies were actually working? So as we looked at voice, we looked at the literature which said that voice practices are universal in application, but that minority workers are often unheard. and often that minority employees are often excluded from decision-making processes. And we saw the literature said that Indigenous employees often suffer more than others from racial and sexual discrimination in the workplace. And Alan was very keen to look at Indigenous employees in the workplace in the public sector. He was really keen to understand the challenges for Indigenous people to have a voice, to be heard, to be, to find out whether they were actually involved in decision making. But he also wanted to look at practical solutions. He is an Indigenous man from this region of the Central Highlands, as I said. So I won't go into the theoretical background apart, but to say, apart from saying that it was a useful background to use because it looks at both direct voice and indirect voice, and it also looks at a range of different types of consultation, participation, information sharing, etc. So Alan's work was based on 3 case studies. Because of his connections in the region, he was able to gain access to 3 organizations which were district levels of public administration agencies. And he eventually managed to get 31 in-depth interviews with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous managers and staff across the 3 case studies. Originally, we'd hoped that we could get Indigenous and non-Indigenous employees, but in actual fact, no non-Indigenous employees agreed to be interviewed. And again, it comes back to the idea this is a very sensitive area. A lot of the government people, the Vietnamese government people in the region were a little bit concerned and a little bit hesitant to get involved and be interviewed because they saw Alan as coming from a foreign university. And some of the Indigenous people were hesitant, first of all, to be involved because they felt that he might be some kind of spy looking at them, etc. So it was a very difficult process. We used a snowballing technique for him to find his interviewees. And he actually spoke to a lot more than 31 people, but only 31 actually finally agreed that they would do formal interviews. He worked in Vietnamese and also in the local Indigenous language, and he did a lot of observation, fieldwork notes, documentary data, etc. And he had to meet his people often in coffee shops and bars and various places to actually get the actual data. And he was really keen for us to identify 6 key themes which came out of the Indigenous challenges. So the 3 organizations had all introduced and interpreted government policy differently. So for example, in one of the organizations, they'd introduced quotas for Indigenous people, where the other 2 hadn't introduced quotas, but they had introduced different elements of the government policy. The problem was, though, that there was a real lack of responsibility and accountability of senior managers for the implementation of this policy. So, for example, there was no monitoring and control as to whether the policy was actually put in place. Very difficult to find out how many Indigenous employees were actually working in these organizations. Very difficult to get information around those. So some resistance for giving information, but also some just didn't have the information to give. One of the things that came out from all of the Indigenous employees was the underlying racism. It's a key issue. It was identified, all of them, and they talked about, they gave many examples, and some of that racism came from the Vietnamese employees who saw the Indigenous people as getting special treatment and felt resentful towards them, and felt that they weren't as qualified for those jobs, and they were just getting those jobs because they were Indigenous. And they made a lot of the Indigenous employees feel very unwelcome in the workplaces. There was lack of support from trade unions because, as you may know, trade unions in Vietnam are very much part of the Vietnamese Communist Party. Their role is very different. They don't independently bargain. They are often have more of a social welfare role. And often it's not unlikely, it's not unusual to have the HR manager in an organization to actually be the union official. So it's not just that Indigenous employees don't get support from trade unions. It is very likely that employees in general don't get the same kind of support as we'd expect here. I think the other thing that really came out was, and again that sort of links to the racism issue, that the non-Indigenous managers had a real lack of awareness of Indigenous differences, Indigenous culture, valuing Indigenous people and the different ways of doing things, and poor managerial skills. And underneath all of that, you could over time there's been a government policy in kind of infantilization of Indigenous people. So all in all, what Alan found was that many Indigenous people actually talked about themselves having low self-esteem, but it's not an intrinsic thing. It's not that, you know, Indigenous people have low self-esteem. It was more about the outcome of racism, the years of infantilization, and also the sort of lack of belonging in the workplace, and how often they were made to feel uncomfortable in the workforce. Of course, there were lots of good examples as well. And the good examples were when there were Indigenous managers who really understood their Indigenous employees and went out of their way to listen, to understand, and to value their people. And that came out a great deal through all of the 3 different case studies. Alan was really keen to think about practice, to think about, well, what could change. So we've got 4 items here, and the first 2 are really about government policy. And the first one is really very contentious, to raising public awareness of Indigenous people by acknowledging them as Indigenous to their land. And that really challenges the idea of the ethnic minorities. And very interestingly, we had a paper accepted for publication recently, but one of the reviewers, who was clearly Vietnamese, took issue with the fact that we were calling the ethnic minorities Indigenous, and we really had to put the case to the editors to say, this is why would we do this, and this is why it's important, because of the big difference between minority and Indigenous. The other suggestion for practice, the other thing that Alan has called for, is for government policies for Indigenous employment to be reviewed, and to invite Indigenous people in that review, and not just individual, you know, Indigenous people, but to actually bring forward people who can really partake in that. He's never used the term self-determination. I think that's something that's politically very sensitive, but underneath, I think that's what we're starting to see. At the organisational level, what we're looking at is improved senior leadership responsibilities within the workplace that actually tackle racism. So it was really interesting that the non-Indigenous managers that he spoke to did not recognise racism, did not understand racism. But for the employees and the Indigenous managers, everyone talked about it, everyone gave examples, and everyone gave examples of the unfair treatment. So the other suggestion for practice in the actual organisation level was supporting Indigenous and non-Indigenous managers to understand inclusive leadership practice, you know, training and development around that. He found lots of examples around what that actually meant. And so that's a really important, one of his really important findings. One of the things that we asked Alan to do was to think about what, you know, the impact of his work, and you'll see some pictures of him there. That's when he graduated last year. He's at RMIT, and we managed to get him to graduate because we have campuses in Vietnam. So he actually graduated in Ho Chi Minh City, which meant that he could bring some of his family along, which was just beautiful. And we asked him to think about, well, what impact has this had? And he actually got a lot of publicity in Vietnam out of his thesis. And you'll see on the slide here, he says how 20, what he calls big state media, have published this. And what he means by that is print media, newspapers, television, and radio. And they shared it in both Vietnamese and their English versions. And I don't know if you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, that sort of little extract there, but it tells a little bit about Alan's story, that Alan came from an area when to get to elementary school, he had to cross rivers and there was no electricity, and he came from a very poor farming background. So the fact that he's the first person of his people to get a PhD, and that is an amazing achievement for him. The other thing that he's done, he's used Facebook, and he's had thousands of comments and likes on Facebook, and he's had quite a big discussion on Facebook in relation to racism. And a lot of Vietnamese people have actually found that really hard to deal with, you know, saying we're not racist, you know, but actually he's been able to give examples of where that is the case. So I like to finish by saying that I'm really honoured to present this work, to Alan's work, to an international audience. And I feel privileged that he has trusted me to do this. But I think his work is so important that it needs to have an international audience. So if you've got any comments later or any questions, I'll be happy to answer whatever I can. And Mark also might be able to answer some questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pauline. That's wonderful. We really appreciate your insights and sharing that work with us. So I look forward to some discussion later on as we move on to the next presentation, which is mine. So I will hope that the screen sharing works. It looks to be good. I'm not a technical person, so the more I try to upgrade, the worse I make things for myself. But hopefully everybody can see that okay. So this session is a collaboration between myself and Anil Verma, who is here on the line, and also I invite Anil to jump in anytime. This paper considers the nexus between non-standard work and Indigenous earnings disparities. The overarching question that we try to speak to in this work is, does non-standard employment exacerbate or mitigate earnings inequalities among Indigenous workers? So I will jump right into the motivation for the study, and that is fourfold. Firstly, we find that in many Western economies, Canada is no exception, growth in various forms of non-standard employment. So most recently in Canada, there's been an increase in temporary contract employment, whereas part-time employment several decades ago grew quite rapidly. Now that's stabilized, and we're seeing increases in temporary work. As we know, there have been long-standing earnings disadvantages experienced by many Indigenous workers in Canada. We use a framework of labor market segmentation theory, which predicts that any disadvantage that exists in the primary sector will also carry over into the secondary sector of the labor market. However, it is not clear from theory alone if the growth of non-standard work is reducing or exacerbating the disadvantage faced by Indigenous workers. There's a premise implicit in this framework that non-standard work belongs to the secondary sector of the labor market. Now that may or may not be the case in all situations, so we are careful not to equate non-standard employment with precarious employment, but we do recognize that there is a risk owing to the insecurity and the typically low wages of many non-standard jobs, that those jobs are also somewhat precarious to varying degrees and therefore likely to be located in the secondary sector of the labor market. What I think is important about the way we approach this research question is that for a long time, studies of Indigenous wage disparities, including my own, have focused on the human capital characteristics of workers as driving the disparity. So they've been very supply side, without giving perhaps enough or sufficient emphasis to the structural factors of the labor market in which earnings are earned in the first place. So we've been placing a lot of, for lack of a better word, blame on individual workers, and looking at this lens of human capital, which is important. But I think looking at the framework in which earnings are earned, the structure and the features of the labor market, is a new lens. So that's kind of the impetus for this study, to look at structural features of the labor market and to what extent may they contribute to earnings disparities. Additionally, we hope that this study will also make the contribution of considering comparator groups. So who is the best comparator for non-Indigenous workers? Each of these subgroups are very heterogeneous. All non-Indigenous workers are very, different, have different characteristics. That's a wide net. Similarly, Indigenous workers are also a heterogeneous group. So whether we include other disadvantaged groups in the non-Indigenous benchmark actually makes a difference to the coefficient estimate. So that's what we try to unpack a little bit more in this study as well. Finally, we use the labor force survey, which is better than the census for this kind of comparison. Most studies of Indigenous, non-Indigenous earnings disparities use the Canadian census, and there are advantages and disadvantages to either data set, but we're using the labor force survey because it has more detailed measures of labor force activity. It allows for these detailed non-standard and standard classifications, and it has a more precise measure of hourly earnings. So we hope that just, kind of coming at this from not only a different framework, but also a different data set will be something that is illuminating. We test 4 hypotheses in this study. The first is that Indigenous workers are overrepresented in non-standard employment as compared to non-Indigenous workers. And the second is that overall Indigenous workers face a significant wage penalty relative to non-Indigenous workers. These 2 hypotheses are simply replicating with our data what has been established in the literature already. So I think the focal point of the paper is this 3rd and 4th hypotheses, being that Indigenous, non-Indigenous earnings disparities will be smaller in non-standard forms of employment than in standard work. And the basis for this prediction comes from labor market segmentation theory, in which the secondary market or segment of the labor market has different wage determining characteristics than the primary sector. If we accept the premise that non-standard jobs are primarily located in the secondary sector, then we might expect the relatively flat earnings in the secondary sector across all workers, thereby muting differences across ethnic and racial groups.
On his dissertation, and he found that there are parts he called.
I hear is the 4th hypothesis is Indigenous, non-Indigenous earnings disparities will remain even when the comparator group excludes immigrants. So while not a theoretically predictable hypothesis, we also estimate Indigenous earnings relative to immigrant earnings. So that's more of an empirical question, but it speaks to the importance of comparison group. We use, as I mentioned, the labor force survey. It's a rotating panel, so respondents may be in the data for up to 6 months. So to avoid repeated measures of the same respondents, we choose to use the month of May from 2008 to 2018. We stack the data for 10 years. We consider employed persons with positive non-missing hourly earnings. And our first approach is to estimate a multinomial logistic regression to predict the probability of non-standard employment, where Indigenous identity is our key independent variable. We then look at OLS earnings regressions to find the adjusted earnings difference between Indigenous and non-Indigenous workers. And then we estimate separate models and decompose them, the overall means gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous workers across various categories of employment. So how do we define non-standard work? It will be no real surprise to this audience. The meaning of non-standard work doesn't need much explanation. However, just to note that the ILO defines non-standard work as any employment relationship that differs from the full-time permanent job performed for a single employer. That can take a great number of permutations depending on your perspective. However, we are somewhat constrained by what is available to us in the data. So we define a standard job as one that is full-time and permanent, and a non-standard job, we define 3 different classifications: a full-time non-permanent job, so that's the contract or the temporary work, and part-time employment. And we break part-time work into whether it is voluntary or involuntary. And we recognize that that voluntary, involuntary distinction can be somewhat problematic. We define in our data an involuntary part-time worker as somebody who has a part-time job but would otherwise want a permanent job. So just to make sure we get in the results, the first is the multinomial regression, where you can see here, looking across the different types of employment, Indigenous workers are more likely to be in non-standard work. The exception being voluntary part-time, which is not statistically significant, but they are more likely to be in full-time non-permanent or involuntary part-time work. So that supports our first hypothesis. Looking at the OLS estimates, we first find the main effect for Indigenous identity, controlling for other observable characteristics, is about a 6% earnings disadvantage relative to non-Indigenous workers. And in this model, we're using as the reference group Canadian-born non-Indigenous. So this is for males, and we've excluded immigrants from this model. Also of note are the negative earnings penalties for all of the forms of non-standard work that become qualitatively larger as we move from full-time non-permanent to the worst case scenario being part-time and involuntary. So hypothesis 2, as we would have predicted, is also supported. Looking at the effects or the different distribution across non-standard categories, we find that illustrated in the results of the Oaxaca decomposition. So first, considering overall the earnings gap, so this is regardless of employment contract, Indigenous persons, males in this case, experience roughly a 9.9% earnings gap in raw mean wages. The interesting finding is that when we look across different categories of work, we find the largest earnings disparities experienced in full-time permanent employment. So it's actually within the standard job that Indigenous workers are experiencing the largest penalties. As you can see in our categories of non-standard work, there's no significant difference in mean earnings for full-time non-permanent or involuntary part-time. The difference in voluntary part-time workers is large, but if you accept that voluntary part-time is in fact reflecting worker agency, that's a choice, then we would be less concerned, arguably, about this disparity. So I think hypothesis 3 is supported, that we are finding consistent with labor market segmentation. Earnings gaps are smaller for workers in non-standard forms of employment. Finally, comparing Indigenous workers with different benchmarks of omitted reference category. The first column here, 1A, considers all non-Indigenous persons, including immigrants. And you can see that the earnings disparity is still statistically significant, but qualitatively smaller than when immigrants are excluded. So because of the typically low earnings of immigrants, especially recent immigrants, having them as part of the comparator group is masking some of the earnings disadvantage experienced by Indigenous workers. And then to the empirical question, comparing immigrant and Indigenous workers, we find that Indigenous workers actually experience a small premium relative to immigrant workers. So model 3A excludes Canadian-born non-Indigenous workers. So hypothesis 4 is also supported. Now that was a very quick run through of all of these numbers. What does it mean? So this is a summary of our findings that I mentioned. All of the 4 hypotheses are supported. I want to look to hypothesis 3 to emphasize that I think the most meaningful outcome of this research is the earnings gap is largest actually in standard work. So in that full-time permanent job is where we find the largest earnings disparities, and less than half of that disparity is attributable to characteristics in the model. So that's something that I think is very important to reflect on, which I'll do in the final slide. Where do we go from here? So to return to the overarching research question, does non-standard employment exacerbate or mitigate earnings inequalities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous workers? Despite smaller or insignificant wage differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous workers in non-standard, the fact that all of the forms of non-standard work are associated with lower wages and Indigenous people are more likely to be represented in non-standard work, we can find some evidence that non-standard work does contribute to overall earnings inequality for Indigenous workers. These findings lead to some important directions of future research. The first one being here, how do we identify and remove barriers that might exclude Indigenous workers from primary labor markets? So that would be the inherent discrimination that exists in Canadian labor markets, the history of colonialism that Indigenous peoples experienced that affects not only labor markets, but also educational institutions. So looking at what are the barriers that might prevent some Indigenous persons from entering primary labor markets. But as we found, even when employed in full-time permanent work, so even in the primary labor market, Indigenous workers experience a sizable disadvantage. Human capital characteristics are important, but only are contributing about half of that gap. So there is a large portion of the earnings gap that is unexplained by the characteristics included in the model. So focus on education is not a panacea for reducing or eliminating earnings disadvantages. This leads to maybe a lot of critical self-examination for organizations and policymakers to look at their practices, particularly, there's my time, to look at the HRM practices and make sure that Indigenous workers have access to internal labor markets and occupational networks. An emphasis on recruitment, selection, training, and mentoring, and making sure that these practices are open and accessible to Indigenous workers would be a starting point both for practice and for policy. So that brings me right to the end of the slideshow. I thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and I welcome your questions during the question period. So I will now turn it over to Mark to take us into the next session, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
There we go. I think I'm unmuted now. Rana, can you just confirm that?
Yes, you're muted.
I'm unmuted. Here we go. Okay.
We can hear you.
Wonderful. Well, greetings and salutations. Leadership in Aboriginal Australian Enterprises, the re-emergent findings. 65,000 years in 15 minutes. Hold on. It's a short presentation, but it's a hell of a story. I acknowledge the contribution of my co-researchers, the owners of knowledge. My name's Mark Jones. I'm a Sovereign Yawuru man. My people come from Rubibi, today known as Broome in Western Australia. I want to acknowledge my supervision team, Professor Pauline Stanton, a Gardia in Yaru, White Ghost, rather apt given Pauline is an Indigenous Northern Celt, and my Aboriginal brother, Professor Mark Rose, a sovereign Gunta man. Wutayi, welcome. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Dish with One Spoon territory and pay my respects to all First Nations people who call these lands home in Toronto, as I too once did, being a resident of Cabbagetown back in the day. Wamajeka, welcome in the language of the Woiwurrung and Bunurong people of the Eastern Kulin Nations, whose unceded lands the business of RMIT University is conducted on. I respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. Further, Wamajeka to all First Nations people of the world with us today. This word Wamajeka, like many English words, has a duplicity of meaning. It also means state your purpose. And I'll do my best within the limited time frame to collapse the complexity of the prevailing social identity categories in an Australian context into the indigene and that of the white coloniser. Acknowledging this macro level overview oversimplifies a great deal of variation and complexity from both sides of the boundary. I'm a sovereign Yaru man. My mob was but one of 650 sovereign Aboriginal nations that thrived in Terra Cognita Australis, great southern land. Australia today comprises some 450 sovereign Aboriginal nations whose lands remain unceded. With considerable reluctance, underpinned by unconscious bias, overt racism and systematic discrimination, replicated across the British colonies, the Australian Commonwealth versus Mabo 1992, with considerable reticence, acknowledged the lie of terra nullius, Latin for no one's land, recognising our people's connection to country. Crudely and rather superficially translating to ownership in a Western capitalist system, albeit on the Crown's terms. That said, the lived experience of British colonisation bears witness to the demise of 200 mobs, 100,000 plus children stolen from their families, massacres, rapes, slavery, and the birthplace of apartheid. These deliberate and systematic government policies were designed to eradicate the Aboriginal problem, creating a multi-generation of trauma identified across key social and economic indicators of life. Our lived experience of the Commonwealth conforms to what the United Nations defines as genocide and continues to do so with every breath we gasp for. A continent owned by linguistically diverse sovereign Aboriginal nations, resplendent with cultural protocols, sophisticated political systems, law, spelled L-O-R-E, values, a thriving creative arts, innovative environmental intervention practices, as well as cross-border and international trade. Aboriginal people have occupied Australia for some 65,000 years. Our elders' leadership practices play a significant part in our ongoing success in making us the oldest continuous living culture in the world. I'm seeking to identify the leadership practices that both sustain and are prevalent in Aboriginal-led commercial enterprises as an antecedent to economic self-determination for communality, the benefit of the many. My Indigenous standpoint is influenced by my mother, Jabur. Blonde but native, a particularly fine specimen, fairer than the majority of Europeans, she was worth saving. Jabur was one of the stolen generation, which is a sanitised term for assimilation that ran from 1900 to 1970, whereby more than 100,000 children were stolen. I was born at the end of that era, one of the first not to be counted amongst the flora and fauna. Unlike those who walked before me, the first in my family to be recognised as a citizen of Australia from birth. And I ask you, how would you feel if at 4 years of age you were ripped from your mother's loving arms? I often wonder how my mother felt. She never spoke of it. I know how Inspector McBeath of the Department of Native Affairs felt as I requested my mother's file from the West Australian Government in December 2017. Officer Timms from the Broome Police and Inspector McBeath launched the original Black Op, right before the wet season set in. You see, they'd failed 3 times previously to get the one they identified as the golden girl. And I have this sentence burnt into my cortex. I can recount McBeath's report verbatim. For about 1 hour and a half, I attempted to reason with this woman. I was most patient, but in the end, I was forced to take the child. I pushed the woman to the ground, kicking her until she relinquished the child. I have a daughter of similar age to my mother when she was taken. I can't imagine how I'd feel or what the effect of such an experience would have on her. How would you feel? The article, Gwyn Too White to be Black, informs me how Granny felt. She never forgave herself and died a broken woman. I know how my aunts and uncles felt, the trauma transferred from their mother to them. My uncle continuing the search more than 50 years after his sister was stolen. How would you feel? I could tell you about a young boy blissfully playing with his toy boats by the calming sounds of water flowing down a creek when the Native Affairs inspector stole him. But that's not my story, that's Professor Rose's story. But it is our shared lived experience of British colonisation. Rose discusses the renaissance of Indigenous knowledge. The reality is Indigenous academics within all Australian universities are few and far between. As such, Indigenous standpoint theory has not deeply challenged the fundamental ontological core of academia. The lack of critical mass, a consequence of the small number of indigene that hold sway in the hallowed halls of academia. Aboriginals are one of the most researched in the academy. The experience has by and large not been beneficial, often positing the Aboriginal as the problem. Academia is not free of its colonial Eurocentric biases. Aboriginal Australians' lived experience of colonisations are recent and personal. If each second on a clock face is representative of 1,000 years of our existence in these lands we now know as Australia, the experience of colonisation represents but a mere 1/4 of a second. Colonisation does not define us as a people. I'm sorry. Very sorry, but until which point in time, all of Australia chooses to see the full picture, accepting our history, a dark past, a black history, and proudly bringing this into the light, our national story will continue to be hobbled by ignorance and may as well start with once upon a time. The contribution I am seeking to make is to Aboriginal self-determination, comprising a political, economic, and intellectual agenda. When I say Kansas, I'm referring to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, who've become known as the Kansas states when discussing indigeneity. These Western settler states, when viewed through the Indigenous lens by the original inhabitants of these lands, are represented by settlers, colonisers, and invaders. There's a shared experience between First Nations, Aboriginal, Maori, and Native Americans. The commonality between the Kansas states can be traced back to the influence on them of the British legal and cultural traditions and the European philosophical traditions they brought with them. In an Australian context, the British came to rapidly dominate society, politically, economically, and culturally at the expense of Aboriginal people, who soon morphed into a minority, exiled to the fringes. We soon became strangers in our own lands. The crux of the issue in an Australian context, since 2005, successive annual Closing the Gap Prime Ministerial reports across a range of quality of life criteria depict the Indigene as lesser than their non-Indigenous Australian counterparts. And I provide a recent Turtle Island example to exemplify our shared lived experience of British colonisation. And I read, "Last week I was sitting beside a non-Indigenous gentleman at the airport, waiting for my connecting flight. He struck up a conversation with me, which for the most part was pleasant enough. He was actually from Sturgeon. When he inquired to what it is I do for work, I informed him that I was chief of my community. His reply was simply, 'Oh, so I pay your salary.' Rather than being insulted and getting angry, I decided to do him a favour and educate him a little. My reply, 'Sir, a little lesson in the basics of economics may give you a better understanding of how things actually work. The very fundamental ingredient for any economy in this world is having a land base, one that is rich in resources. These resources are harvested, extracted, or grown from that land. This creates work, commodities, and revenues. This in turn creates a workforce that pays into a tax base that creates roads, infrastructure, schools and hospitals. The workforce in turn needs services and goods, which expands the economy, creating more business and more jobs. Pretty basic stuff. Now, what do you think the land base came from? The Indigenous people of Canada signed treaties to share our land base so Indigenous and non-Indigenous could all prosper from the richness of the land base. Instead, our people got raped, murdered, thrown into residential schools, jails, and marginalised from the economic benefits of our own land and became the poorest people as a result. So no matter what job or business you have, Indigenous people have paid and continue to pay your salary every single day, whether you'd like to admit it or not. No land base equals no country, equals no economy, equals no job. It's really that simple. And I note intergroup conflict exists even when no competition for resources exists, and contests for land often indeed are contests for life. Leadership theory is voluminous with varying perspectives. I'm focusing on leadership in Aboriginal Australian founded commercial enterprises. Social identity is in essence the relationship between in and out groups, the existence of positive bias towards one's own group, the in-group, the identification of prejudices, discrimination and stereotyping, homogeneously applied to out-groups, and the reality that both minimal motivation is required and one does not have to be a bad person to enact such. I'm applying social identity constructs to Aboriginal Australian commercial entities, which previously has not been done. Callio aligns First Nations economic leadership with that of authentic leadership, whilst Rue identifies the nexus of Maori and servant leadership in business. Scant attention has been paid to Aboriginal enterprise leadership, noting the necessity to walk in two worlds, that of the capitalist system whilst also meeting the Aboriginal community's expectations. Commentary is rife regarding Aboriginal identity. It's never far from the surface, whether that be the back page or the front page. Aboriginal identity comprises a three-part definition entailing dissent, acknowledgement and acceptance. However, such misses the point from a self-determination perspective in that Indigenous identity concerns are the responsibility and jurisdiction of relevant First Nations communities, elders and respected leaders exclusively. These are not matters that should enable the colonial obsession of inscribing definition and category on First Nations bodies. The Australian definition of an Aboriginal enterprise was initially influenced by both Canada and the US, requiring an Indigenous entity to be 51% owned, managed, operated and controlled by an Indigenous person. Aboriginal agencies' remit is the advancement of the Indigenous estate. Aboriginal agencies exist with both national and state-based footprints, but without consensus on what defines an Aboriginal enterprise. Indigenous methodologies are reflective of research by, with and for Indigenous people, not just about. In 2018-19, the Ngami meetups hosted at RMIT University for Aboriginal entrepreneurs provided the backdrop for me to develop a relationship with community. Importantly to note, I am a Yawuru man, I'm not of this country, and as such, I am considered a foreign national, a member of an out-group. World Indigenous knowledge is comprised ways of knowing, being and doing, with the sharing of such knowledge based upon an oral tradition. Yarning, as a method, is a semi-structured discussion. To the casual observer, the straightforward concept encapsulated by the unassuming term of yarning, an Indigenous cultural form of conversation, is a concept that easily transcends national and cultural divides. The notion of yarning in its many guises is as diverse as the many Aboriginal nations that traverse the Australian continent and bears witness to the intricate depth of this most time-honoured Indigenous knowledge transfer instrument. Yarning reflects a formal process of sharing knowledges that is reliant upon relationships, expected outcomes, responsibility and accountability between participants, country and culture. Aboriginal Australians recognise yarning as a conversational method culturally ascribed, congruent with an Indigenous paradigm and a cooperative way of sharing stories and information, resulting in the acquisition of new meaning in a culturally safe domain. Indigenous standpoint theory is complex. It's not broadly understood in the academy, and I'll summarise it with the 4 R's. Recognising the lived experience of Indigenous peoples, resonating an emancipatory underpinning with self-determination at its core, reverberating with the echo of an Indigenous voice, retaining the knowledge for co-researchers, and communality, the benefit of the many. Kovac says it's not the method per se that is the determining characteristic of Indigenous methodologies, but rather the interplay, the relationship between the method and the paradigm, and the extent to which the method itself is congruent with an Indigenous worldview. Aboriginal agencies play a pivotal role in determining what is and is not an Aboriginal enterprise. Determining eligibility to a range of support services and the opportunity to tender for specified contracts, often linked to set-asides for Indigenous enterprises, is augmented through the government programs such as the Indigenous procurement policy and/or private sector corporate reconciliation action plans in relation to procurement. Indigenous Business Australia highlights the ubiquitous experience that overwhelmingly Aboriginal people cannot access mainstream capital, and yet they far exceed Australian business survival rates. Supply Nation certifies Aboriginal enterprises' identity. For every $1 of revenue generated, these enterprises provide in excess of $4 social return, and their workforce composition comprises 35% Indigenous peoples. Aboriginal enterprises are 100 times more likely to employ Aboriginal employees than non-Indigenous employers. Kinaway importantly recognises Aboriginal enterprises comprising 50-50 partnerships, including that with a non-Indigenous person. We know one can influence management and control of commercial entities with far less than 50% ownership. I'm suggesting relational leadership, an all-encompassing term that groups together a range of approaches that focuses on leadership as a relationship, is more prevalent in Aboriginal enterprises. Importantly, a cultural mandate of reciprocity of relationship and its qualities lies at the core of such interactions between leader and follower, and is congruent with Aboriginal ways of knowing, being, and doing. A recurrent statement: we determine who is and isn't an Aboriginal enterprise, not the government, is evident. Surprisingly, some Aboriginal agencies are reconsidering their entity definitions. Colonisation in relation to Aboriginal culture and the effect on identity has had a direct influence based on colonisation occurring at different times. Urban, regional and remote locations whereby geographical advantage and disadvantage exists has influenced in-group favouritism. There appears to be a rise in Aboriginal national identity. Evidence of white cladding is indicative of the evolution of more nuanced practices. Working in two worlds is evidenced by the statement, sometimes I'm an Aboriginal owner of business, at other times it's an Aboriginal enterprise. Success is likely to have different or additional criteria than that which is calibrated using purely a Western capitalist rationale. Founders have significant work experience and education, noting most are born post-1970. They are likely to employ other Aboriginal people, utilise Aboriginal supply chains, often at times to the detriment of profit, provide real-world experience and mentoring in their entities for emerging talent, contribute both financially and with their time to support community endeavours. Enterprise ownership provides the opportunity to address some of the closing the gap criteria. This is reinforced through the lived experience of founders who've clearly identified a desire for healthy lifestyles, education and leisure time together, whilst respectfully recognising those who have walked before them. Gala Mabu, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Mark, for your presentation.
No worries.
It was great, and I wish we could keep on going, but in the interest of time, we'll move to our final presenter and then offer some opportunity for questions and comments from the audience. So with that, I turn it over to Mary Eve for the final presentation.
Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'll share my screen. Are you seeing it? Everybody?
We're good.
Okay. Good morning. My presentation is the result of a research project conducted in collaboration with my colleague, Jean-Michel Beaudoin. And this is a project carried out with financial support from Sustainable Forest Initiative, MITAX, and La Clé en Foresterie Autochtone of Laval University. Although hard to believe with the high unemployment rates of the last 4 months, the labor market is currently facing a labor shortage affecting all economic sectors in several industrialized countries. Far from being resolved, the shortage will, on the contrary, worsen in the coming years under the pressure of aging. In the province of Quebec, the forest industry is one of the main regional economic drivers, generating nearly 60,000 direct and indirect jobs. In this industry, it is estimated that 15,000 positions will need to be filled by 2022 in the province. Like other marginalized groups, such as women or members of visible minorities, Indigenous peoples in Canada face barriers to accessing labor markets, placing them in disadvantage as in economic and professional insecurity. In this regard, let us mention in particular the low level of education, insufficient training, the level of mastery of the French and English languages, single parenthood, as well as discrimination. At the same time, several Indigenous communities want to increase their participation in the forest economy. This desire is in line with the Quebec forestry regime, which creates a favorable context for job creation for Indigenous peoples. Similarly, the most recent sectorial workforce diagnosis of the Quebec forest management industry indicates that Indigenous workers represent an interesting pool of candidates for the forest sector. But despite this, members of Indigenous communities remain difficult to attract and retain. Several researchers in Canada have focused on Indigenous and their communities in various academic fields. In forest sciences, research has focused on the participation of Indigenous communities in the forestry sector on aspects such as the inclusion of knowledge and values, and the participation in decisions and relations with industry. The contribution of Aboriginal business to the sector's economy and obstacles to employability such as education, state of health. You have also the creation of an organizational environment conducive to the recruitment, integration, and retention of Indigenous workforce. In social sciences and administration, we observe a section of the literature that has lingered to intercultural differences in elements such as the relation to time, the role of family, the work-family conflict, the earnings disparities, or different aspects of education. Few studies seem to have examined the participation of Indigenous in the labor force in the forest industry as proven collaborators. Going further, no study to our knowledge has looked at the views of Indigenous workers on the issues of attraction and retention, a perspective that we adopt in our study. So more specifically, our research project was aimed at trying to document a better understanding the motivations of Indigenous workers toward jobs in the forest sector, as well as the obstacles they face. Therefore, we have promoted the views of Indigenous workers on the behaviors they adopt and the meanings they attach to them. By doing this, we seek to recognize the value and legitimacy of their perspectives and representations rather than draw conclusions for them. The research project was carried out using a collaborative approach through a partnership with 3 Indigenous communities in the province of Quebec. This assures us a diversity of participants at the geographic, demographic, economic, and cultural levels. We made no distinction with regard to workers residing outside the reserve territory. We conducted 64 semi-structured interviews between February 2016 and February 2018. 14 respondents were from the Innu community of Mastoyash, 26 respondents were from the Innu community of Pessamit, and 24 respondents came from the Atikamekw community of Wemantashi. The respondents' profile is as follows. As you can see, all workers are indigenous. 16 were employed workers in the forestry sector. 19 were unemployed workers in the forestry sector. 5 were employed workers having left the forestry sector. 6 were unemployed workers having left the forestry sector, and 18 were employers and others actors in the same sector. A semantic analysis of the verbatim was carried out using the in vivo software. And here I present the aggregate results. 12 motivational or attractive factors for work have been identified. Here are the most frequently mentioned. The attraction factor most frequently mentioned by respondents is the presence of role models, whether they be family members or others. Respondents report that they were influenced in their choice to find a job in the forest industry by members of their entourage who either worked in forestry or encouraged them to do so. The second attraction factor is the perception of a lack of alternative employment. We're talking here either of a lack of alternative employment on the labor market, which comes from a scarcity of jobs within or near the community, or the fact that the respondents have a low level of education, limiting access to jobs in other economic sectors. Respondents also report as an attraction factor the fact that forestry jobs allow them to be able to work in the forest outside. This factor is associated for respondents with various elements, such as attachment to the territory, a feeling of well-being, freedom, or a need to practice a job outside as opposed to an office work. Note that the respondents also mentioned the fact that these jobs meet financial needs. This is a necessity to support themselves and their families. The work here has an utilitarian character. Not here that the interest in having a job in the forestry sector does not necessarily differ from a job in another economic sector. In the same line, for some respondents who lived on income from the social assistance program of the government of Quebec, or who held minimum wage jobs, employment in the forestry sector can also be seen as a way to increase their income. The fifth attraction factor that stands out is the importance of work. Respondents report that having a job in the forestry sector can be explained by the simple desire to have a job or to be active. Associated with this is the desire to avoid becoming a social assistance recipient. The valuation associated with having a job is also mentioned, and there is also the fact that holding a job is a stimulating challenge. In addition to the attraction factor towards the occupation of a job in forestry, the results also show that certain elements constitute obstacles hindering the occupation of such a job. Among the 10 obstacles reported by respondents, I present the 6 most frequently mentioned. And the first obstacles mentioned by the respondents is the difficult reconciliation of personal and professional life. It appears to be explained by the necessity distance between the working environment and the worker's residence for variable periods of time, depending on the companies and jobs. A 7 days or more stay in a place of accommodation or a forest camp is often required. The second obstacle is the difficult access to transportation. Associated with the remoteness of jobs from the place of residence, there is the question of the transport to the workplace. Several respondents are unable to afford the cost of transportation to their forest camps, whether it be shuttles or the purchase of a vehicle, or do not hold a driver's license. The third obstacle is the conciliation of work and traditional indigenous activities. As I mentioned earlier, the indigenous communities attach particular importance to the forest, which is at the heart of their traditional values. In this context, the practice of traditional activities such as fishing or hunting matters. The seasonality of forestry work is likely to interfere with such activities, and respondents believe that working in the forest decreases the time available to practice these activities. Despite this, some are finding ways to reconcile the two. Respondents also mentioned that precariousness of jobs. Forest work is seasonal work during the summer period and precarious too, so working does not guarantee employment for the following year. And the number of workers hired depends on the contract awarded to the companies. In addition to the uncertainty associated with holding a job from one year to the next, workers face the difficulty of working the minimum number of hours required by the government employment insurance program to be entitled to the benefit. We should also add that this precariousness restricts access to bank financing. In an attempt to improve their situation, some workers slow down their pace of work or try to obtain additional contracts. Respondents also talk about the low level of education and the lack of training. It has been shown that high school diploma is lower among Indigenous people than in the rest of the Canadian population, and this hinders access to jobs. In the forestry sector, the high school diploma is often the minimum education level required. Finally, another obstacle comes down to personal difficulties. Some personal difficulties were reported by respondents as having a negative effect on employability. For example, alcohol consumption, family problems, and legal problems were mentioned. The Quebec forest industry sees Indigenous workers as a solution to the scarcity of labor. And the government of Quebec recently funded a pilot project to review the compensation methods for workers in this economic sector. Despite this pool of workers remains difficult to attract. Our research suggests that the attraction of Indigenous workers to the forest sector is favored by a set of intrinsic and extrinsic factors to the characteristic of the industry, including certain values of Indigenous culture. The increased participation of Indigenous communities through partnerships, collaborations, consultation, and accommodations promotes a positive image of forestry, which can in turn enhance the attractiveness of the sector. Certain conditions of employment play an important role in the attraction of Indigenous towards forestry jobs, whether in terms of attraction factors or even as an obstacle to occupying these jobs. Incidentally, it should be noted that organizations and their managers would benefit from reviewing the definition of family and better understanding the place it occupies from Indigenous workers. The attraction factors show the importance of a policy for managing diversity in the forest sector, which must involve practices aimed at better understanding and taking into account Indigenous sociocultural values and realities. The attraction of Indigenous workforce goes beyond the power of organizations alone and challenges public policies. Given the importance of models in the attractiveness of the forest sector, traditional recruitment strategies should be revamped. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mary Eve. And thanks again to all of our presenters for your work. We now have some time for questions and comments from the group. So if you'd like to type in your question, I see there are a few that have come up in the group chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question, whichever method is preferable to you. So if I look at the group chat, some of the questions that have been already recorded, we have one for Mark. A question from Ushnish asks, are Indigenous enterprise in Australia different in terms of labor relations? Are there more worker-owned cooperatives? Are there more unionized workplaces? I recognize these are Eurocentric lenses.
Here we go. I'm unmuted. Look, the question's probably out of my focus. I don't look at social enterprises, which would probably pertain more to prescribed body corporates, which are the holders of native title, because we've got 460 different nations. So I'm not sure how they operate, because I've focused on leadership and founders, people who can own because they're easier to assess their direct influence over self-determination related to the, in particular, the closing the gap criteria. So I can't answer that one. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, there's another one here for you, Mark, while you're on the line.
Yep.
This question is from Allison. She asks if you can explain white cladding a little bit more.
I can. So if I flip it the other way and give you what black cladding means in an Australian sense, where it's from Supply Nations perspective, who actually audit black cladding. So it's the practice of a non-Indigenous business entity or individual taking unfair advantage of an Indigenous business entity, typically through a joint venture, so that they can access contracts and procurement opportunities that have been set aside for Indigenous businesses. So what I hear in the interview data is we learned it off the non-Indigenous business owners, and white cladding is the deliberate targeting of different white or non-Indigenous enterprises that will allow the Indigenous enterprise to successfully get a contract. So it's essentially, in many ways, the reverse of black cladding.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mark. So I have another question. Just trying to scroll through, make sure I get everyone's comments. Johanna has a question for Mary Eve. Joanna asks, are there Indigenous owned or operated forestry companies in Quebec? If yes, are they different?
Yes, there's a few number of companies that are owned or operated by Indigenous, but for sure they are perceived as more attractive by Indigenous workers. The problem is that these companies are smaller than the ones owned by non-Indigenous, and so they don't have access to the more lucrative contracts. So they cannot offer even enough number of hours to Indigenous workers.
Great, thank you. There's a question to me from Allison. Allison asks that, Danielle, you spoke about male Indigenous workers. Are the differences more profound for Indigenous women? The paper does consider Indigenous females as well, and the similar patterns emerge. I just, in the interest of time, presented only the results for males, but if you're interested, I'd be happy to send you the paper that shows the results for females as well. Now I have a question from Anil. I'll ask Anil if he wants to unmute. He has a question for the panel.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I just want to add a very short footnote to the presentation by Danielle. And I think one general point to take away from that paper is not only the technical results, but that in a lot of Indigenous, non-Indigenous comparisons, many studies have omitted the kind of heterogeneity that exists in the non-Indigenous group. So when we parse out, let's say, immigrants, and we only did that with one group, and there are some other groups that you can also exclude. And then you realize that the disparity, the wage penalty for Indigenous workers is even larger when you compare them with native-born Canadians of European descent. I had a question for Pauline, and I'm sorry that Dr. Alang can't be with us. So if you don't have the answer, I would understand. You nicely explained the confusion between Indigenous and ethnic minorities, but I did not get any resolution of that issue. Is there a resolution in terms of how many are truly Indigenous and how many are, so it remains an unresolved issue? I see you shaking your head.
It's a very, my understanding is it's a very political issue in Vietnam. So when you look at the reports that come from the Vietnamese government, they use the term ethnic minorities and very much resist the term Indigenous. Mm-hmm. And there are certainly some ethnic minority groups who were not Indigenous to that land.
So in that connection, the other question I had was, the ILO has Convention 169. And in fact, at this conference, we had a session on that. Is Vietnam a signatory to that convention?
I think it is. I'm not sure, but I think it is. Interestingly, so I think definitely there's been resistance by the Vietnamese government to using the term Indigenous. I think we're starting to see some changes though, because I think what we're starting to see is that the Vietnamese government is actually recognizing that its Indigenous population in areas like the Central Highlands, where Alan did his research, are actually have huge opportunities for tourism when we can all start traveling again, of course. And so I think they're starting to recognize that there's a benefit from recognizing these groups as Indigenous groups rather than just ethnic minorities. And interestingly, in one of the newspaper reports that Alan actually presented to us, which was written in English and in Vietnamese, the Vietnamese newspaper has used the term Indigenous. So I think we might be seeing some change, and as some discussion. And certainly the interactions that he's had on Facebook with a whole range of different people, with people from government and a whole range of, that debate is starting to happen. But I would say at this stage, it is still unresolved. And it's very sensitive because of, as I said before, the political history, the different approaches to land, all of those things. I hope that answers your question as best I can.
Yeah, I think you've done well in answering the question. I just smiling because this the term that is very sensitive is code for not dealing with it, and you know, we study and teach about the ILO, and to me, it seems like this is another instance where the ILO could be a key player by saying to member states that, look, there are international laws about indigenous people, and you cannot just create your own reality within your own country by saying that, look, this is a topic that we don't want to go there. Well, then you should quit the ILO. You know,
Look, I think the Vietnamese government would say, but we are doing, you know, we are doing these things. And certainly the policy, the priority policies have had an impact. So there's a lot more Indigenous doctors in the regions. There's a lot more Indigenous teachers now. So they certainly, it's not that they're not doing anything. It's just that some of the language around it is a bit more nuanced for a number of reasons. So to give you an example, when Alan first came to us to do his study, and we started to talk about Indigenous research and the literature, that being different from ethnic minorities, he was quite, you know, worried about that. It took a while for him to really grasp the nuances on that. So it's not that the Vietnamese government's not doing anything. I don't want to suggest that.
But certainly until you agree to define it, you don't have a way to measure it. And if you can't measure it, then everything is very soft, it's unreliable.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And measurement in the organizations wasn't happening.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a few more questions here in the queue from Beatrice. First asked Mary Eve, have you noticed a difference between the participants who had worked in the forest sector versus those who were still employed in the sector and those who had left the sector? And have you noticed the particular jobs and particular business models for which the workers interviewed worked, and did it make a difference in their answers?
I have to mention that for now, we didn't try comparison between types of respondents. And I have to mention that it's hard to find Indigenous workers participating to our research project. We're having respondents living in territories, so we don't see any difference between Indigenous workers living on territory or not living on territory. And I think that for the second part of the second question, it seems to have difference with Indigenous workers working in factories in comparison with workers working directly in the forest, because the employment conditions are completely different and maybe easier for workers working in factories than in the forest.
Thank you. The second question from Beatrice is to me. It is, have you considered gathering data for Indigenous people on territories or reserves which are not available in the LFS? And do you think it could impact the results? Yes, that is a great question, and you are right. They're not available in the LFS. These data are available in the census. Unfortunately, the census is missing other variables that would be necessary to this analysis. But the distinction between those living on reserves and off is very important because there's different labor market conditions that prevail between those two contexts. So it's definitely a point well taken, but due to a dearth in data, we can't readily answer that, unfortunately. So I have Johanna in line here has a question for Pauline. So I ask Johanna, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thanks, Danielle. And I just want to say thank you to the whole panel, in particular for everybody sharing their stories, or, you know, Pauline sharing Dr. Alang's stories and Mark sharing your stories. It's really illuminating, I think, particularly for us in Canada to learn about Indigenous people in other spaces and those cultures. So thank you for bringing that to us. Pauline, in terms of the sort of public and private sector in Vietnam, my sense is that the research was looking at people in the public sector.
Yes.
Is that because of some of these initiatives that there are kind of more of the ethnic minority or the Indigenous population working in those spaces, or I guess what's the kind of distribution? I'm just wondering about that background.
So my understanding that the government priority policies were very much about trying to create pathways to employment for Indigenous people into the public sector. And so that's where you actually get most Indigenous people. We did early on, when we were discussing the field work, we did wonder about trying to get into a private organization, but we just felt that the numbers of people were not there. So it was, and also I think with case study research is also an element of serendipity, and Alan had contacts and people who could help him in the public sector. So we knew that had the public sector where they had the biggest impact in terms of the priority policies, and it was easier to get into those areas than it was to get into any private sector organizations. But I think you raise a good point, because I mean, Alan is now looking at the private sector. That's his next research area. And he's quite keen to take what he learned to see, what he can find out in other types of organizations.
Thank you. So we have a few more questions, which is wonderful. I know Allison is in the queue to ask a question, but before I move to Allison, we had a question come up here for Mark. So maybe to give Mark a few minutes to respond. This is a great one, and I would be very interested in your recommendations as well. It's from Dion. She asks, Mark, could you recommend a book or article that could introduce Eurocentric scholars to Indigenous methodologies and approaches to research? So I think that's a wonderful question. And if you have anything, or if you want to take a few moments, that would be great to speak to that question.
So my question is for the whole panel. I just thinking about Indigenous experiences at work and how to make that better. And I'm sorry if my question is a little bit convoluted, but like as a first generation settler, I'm a little bit newer to the complexities of Indigenous experiences in the world. But I'm just thinking about, Marie-Eve was talking about experiences in forestry work, and then other experiences with boundaries and borders, and hearing about what's going on in Vietnam with their Indigenous populations there. And in talking to, people in Canada where I reside about the nature of Indigenous experiences and how to improve it, it often comes down to acknowledgement beyond the superficial by the government of the Indigenous situation and their history and their past and what they're experiencing now, how it reverberates in the future. And but then when you talk to politicians, etc., this amorphous issue of, well, and they never actually come out and say this, but acknowledging the Indigenous question within borders often can put at risk modern external borders. And for example, in Canada, there are some people who feel that our southern border may be threatened by the US and our northern border by Russia or whoever else is going through the northern straits. And I'm just thinking in terms of like how to bridge that divide so that we start actually looking at these issues, because people in power seem to be dancing around the issue of the who was here first kind of thing, and unwilling to acknowledge that. And if you put aside, reparations and economic questions, I'm just wondering how we can go there. And I'm sorry if that my question is really inarticulate. It's a lot of different things coming together from all of your presentations that were amazing and really enlightening. And I'm just wondering if you could just general reflections, general thoughts on addressing that.
I'm willing to have a go, and then I'd like to encourage Mark to say something here. But I'll start off as a non-Indigenous person living in Australia, not from Australia originally. I think some things are actually quite simple. I think the first thing is actually about understanding our history and some truth telling. And I think certainly in Australia, a lot of people find that really hard because truth telling means hearing the bad stuff. And there's been a lot of bad stuff. And it's not so much about feeling guilty about the bad stuff, it's actually recognizing it and listening to it. And we've heard Mark's story about his mother. How would you feel? You know, so I think that's the first thing. And I would really like Mark to say something. And I think the second thing is voice and actually listening to Indigenous people and recognizing that voice means self-determination. And I think that's, again, is a challenge for non-Indigenous people. And I think the link to that is trust. I actually think that many non-Indigenous people do not trust Indigenous people. And I think many Indigenous people, because of the history, don't trust non-Indigenous people. And I think those are the things, but I would really encourage Mark to have a say, because I think he'll definitely have something to say on that. So MJ, where are you? MJ, where are you?
I think you're muted, Mark.
Oh, it's, so I didn't, I got to apologise. I was busy rattling off 3 key books for the other question. Yeah, you should jump in here, Mark Rose. You know, you probably noticed, you know, Mark, he's Gunta Jamara, you know, I'm a Yaru. We were only allowed to be named Mark for a period of time. Yeah, that's my sixth sense of humour. Oh, Mark, you're on. Answer that question for me. Do me a favour.
Okay. Each country's got a whole lot of Indigenous academics. Here in Australia, we would name a dozen, but it's a global organisation that has meets every year internationally. It's met in Port Francis, not far from Toronto, a number of times. It's called WINHEC, World Indigenous Nations Higher Ed Consortium. They put out an annual journal, and there you've got a smorgasbord of Indigenous academics from around the world. But some of the early adopters in Indigenous knowledge, Mark's mentioned in his presentation, but the Smiths, Graham and Linda Smith from Aotearoa or New Zealand, definitely good. Yeah, there's a number of books, and they're growing as the rise of the Black Academy or the renaissance of Indigenous knowledge. And if you're a non-Indigenous person, by stepping out of your comfort zone, your knowledge system into another will only make you a stronger academic. So don't be fearful of it. And yeah.
I just wondering how, like in Canada, we've had our Reconciliation Commission, and they came out with all these recommendations, and we've had the final report of the missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada come out, and they had all their recommendations, but there still hasn't been a lot of movement, and not, there's been some public acknowledgement, but it's just sort of everybody seems to be like, now what, you know? And I'm just wondering how we push past that, and if you had any advice about that.
Sorry, I just really want to hear Mark Jones's recommendations for the 3 books before. I wanted to make sure that we got that too.
Thank you, Dion. I wanted to also turn it back to Mark for your book recommendations, and then if there's some time, we can return to this important discussion.
Sure. There's an excellent scholar, Margaret Kovach. She's Canadian. Indigenous methodologies. Mark Rose has just mentioned, Linda Tuai Smith, a compilation, titled Research is Resistance. Research is Ceremony. Sean Wilson's also good. And I think it's a compilation. It's called Indigenous Research Methodologies, by an author, CHILSA, Chilsa, if that's, I think that's how you pronounce it. They're pretty good. Probably to just jump back maybe to what Mark was saying and Alison, I mean, last, you know, I put that slide up, I think the third one. Our Prime Minister said, we don't need to bring Black Lives Matters. We don't need to import Black Lives Matters into Australia. Well, he's damn right we don't. Since 1991, we've had 432 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's deaths in custody. Our same Prime Minister the week before said Australia didn't have slavery. I mean, there's the leader of our country. That's highly offensive. We had slavery up until 1953. So, you know, that's offensive. So it's pretty tough when we have this history of forgetfulness that it doesn't exist. And that's why, you know, what Pauline's saying is until we actually bring it out into the light and acknowledge it and, you know, accept the fact that we had these things, yeah, it's pretty challenging to move forward. I mean, we only got an apology for the stolen generations. You know, when was it, Mark? Not that long ago, a decade ago. So the stolen generations is like the equivalent, I think, of your residential schools in Canada. So we have all, you know, these things that exist, and we know it, and when it comes out, because it's not in our education system, you know, we've only been recognised as citizens since 1967. We've been denied education. That's why, you know, this concept of I've never heard of intergenerational wealth transference from an Aboriginal parent. It might exist, I would think it would, but certainly not in any of my research, not in any of my relationships do I know incredibly wealthy Aboriginal people that have inherited wealth from, in a Western capitalist sense, from their parents or family. But anyway, haven't got an answer for you, Alison. I think it's very difficult.
I appreciate the effort.
Thank you. So it looks like we are moving into the next session, but I want to once again thank the presenters for sharing their deeply personal and important studies. And it's unfortunate we have to confine ourselves to this amount of time, but I think you really did impart a lot of knowledge. Certainly, I gained a lot from this, and I really appreciate your time and your scholarship. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in the rest of the conference.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Great session. Thank you, Danielle.
Great session. Thank you.
Thank you for keeping you so late.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, no worries. Past my bedtime. See ya. Bye.
Hey, well done, mate. That was great. Well done.